Welcome to the first lecture video for Unit 1. In Unit 1, we're going to be studying all things linear. In the first section, we're going to be looking at linear equations in one variable. Then, in section 1.2, we'll learn about linear inequalities in one variable. In section 1.3, we'll bump it up a notch and study linear equations in two variables. And we'll finish in section 1.4 with systems of equations in two variables. So our theme will remain the same throughout Unit 1, all things linear. Section 1.1 focuses on linear equations in one variable. This video will cover section 1.1.1, operations with fractions. Now, have your notes ready, have your calculator ready. We'll be talking about calculator tips along the way, and we're basically looking at a review of operations with fractions in this section, beginning with multiplication of fractions. To multiply fractions, it's very simple. If we have something like a over b times c over d, we simply multiply straight across the numerators and straight across the denominators. No common denominator is necessary. That makes this operation a piece of cake. So let's try an example. 3 halves times 1/5. We're going to multiply straight across the numerators. 3 times 1 is 3, and straight across the denominators. 2 times 5 is 10. And we end up with 3/10. That is the correct answer. It is in reduced form, and so we'll leave it at that. Let's look at the next example. Example B, 4/7 times 3/16. Now, in this case, we could go ahead and multiply straight across, and let's do that to begin with. 4 times 3 is 12. 7 times 16, we can type that into our calculator, make sure we get the right value. Looks like 112. So we have 12 over 112. However, that is not a reduced fraction. Anytime you do any operation on fractions, the answer should be in reduced form. So we need to find a common factor between the top and the bottom. In this case, 4 will work. So we're going to divide 12 by 4 to get 3, and we can divide 112 by 4 to get 28. And our fraction then is reduced. Our final answer is 3 over 28. Now let me show you something to watch for so you can avoid having to reduce such large fractions. If I go back to this original problem and I notice there's already a visible common factor between the numerator and the denominator, I can cancel beforehand. So I notice that 4 and 16 have a common factor of 4. So I'm going to divide each of those numbers by 4 and reduce ahead of time. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 16 divided by 4 is 4. Then I can multiply straight across. 1 times 3 is 3. 7 times 4 is 28. And I end up with the same answer, the correct answer. If you'll watch for common factors ahead of time and reduce before you multiply, your numbers will be smaller and a little bit easier to work with. Before we proceed, let me show you one more thing. Let's evaluate this with our calculator. 4/7 times 3/16. You want to make sure that you know how to enter fractions into your calculator. So to enter a fraction, we're going to type in the numerator and we're going to use the divided by operation for the fraction bar. So we have 4 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 16. We're going to press enter to get the result. Notice the calculator reports the answer in decimal form. I'm just going to convert that back to a fraction. So over here on the left side of your keypad, you see the math button. If you'll press the math button, notice option number 1, fraction, is highlighted. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter. And then enter again, and the calculator takes the previous decimal answer and converts it to a fraction, and we have 3 over 28. So we know that we did our operation correctly. I encourage you to use your calculator to check your work so that you can catch those little calculation errors that we all make. Let's move on to division of fractions. Division is dependent on multiplication. When we divide fractions, we're going to make two changes. The first change is that we're going to change the operation from division to multiplication, and we're going to invert that second fraction. When we convert it to multiplication, then we know multiply straight across the numerators and straight across the denominators. And as always, we need to reduce our answer. So let's try 2/3 divided by 4/5. So again, we're going to make two changes. The first fraction stays the same. My first change is to change the operation from division to multiplication and then invert our second fraction. You can proceed with multiplication at this point, but stop and check, can we reduce before we multiply? And in this case, we can. Notice the numerator and denominator have a common factor of 4. Common factor of 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 4 divided by 2 is 2. Now we can multiply straight across. 1 times 5 is 5, and 3 times 2 is 6. So it looks like our answer is 5, 6. But let's use our calculator to make sure we got the right answer. So first we'll type in 2/3, 2 divided by 3. Then we're going to divide by 4/5. 4 divided by 5. Remember, we convert this back into a fraction with our math button, and we end up with, what do you think happened here? Whoops. I typed this in on purpose to show you what happens if you're not careful with parentheses. We're going to see this quite often. The calculator is confused about the order of operations. So when we type this into the calculator to get the correct answer, we have to be sure and put that second fraction in parentheses. For good measure, you may want to put the first one in parentheses as well so that you can really distinguish between the two on your calculator. So the parentheses are above the 8 and 9. We can type in 2 divided by 3, close parentheses, divided by another set of parentheses, 4 divided by 5. And then convert back to a fraction with your math button. Now we're good to go. So your calculator is very useful, but you certainly want to spend some time learning the correct syntax. So let's move on to the next operation. When we multiply and divide fractions, we do not need a common denominator, but when we add and subtract fractions, it is required. So we're going to start with the simplest case first, that is adding and subtracting fractions with like denominators. So our example here has the common denominator. Notice that common denominator shifts to the result and we apply the operation in the numerator only. Remember, when we multiply the numerators together and the denominators. Well, if we're adding and subtracting, we simply translate that denominator over to our answer. So let's give it a try. 1/8 plus 3/8. We know that the result will have the same denominator as 8. And then we'll add our two numerators. 1 plus 3 equals 4. Now we're not quite finished until we have reduced the fraction. So 4 and 8 have a common factor of 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 8 divided by 4 is 2. So our final answer looks like 1/2. Let's be sure we're correct with our calculator. Let me clear my home screen here, and we'll type it in as 1 divided by 8 plus 3 divided by 8. Parentheses are not necessary on this one. And turn it back into a fraction. 1/2, we are good to go. The next example still has a common denominator, but we're looking at subtraction. So since the operation is subtraction, we keep the same denominator. Let's evaluate the numerator. We have 1 minus 7. That gives us -6. This results in -6 divided by 3. Notice there's a common factor of 3 between the top and the bottom. 3 divided by 3 is 1. -6 divided by 3 is -2. So our final answer is -2 over 1, or we'll reduce that to -2. Let's double check with our calculator. 1/3 minus 7/3, math number 1, fraction, we get -2. So when you see your calculator verifying what you calculated by hand, it can really build your confidence to know that you got the right answer. Moving on to page 2. Now we're going to figure out what do we do when we have unlike denominators. To add or subtract fractions with unlike denominators, first write the fraction as equivalent fractions with like denominators. Then add or subtract the numerators and place over the like denominator. So this example is 3/4 plus 2/7. We need to get a common denominator between 4 and 7. One possible way to find a common denominator is to take your largest number, 7, and list its multiples. 7 times 1 is 7. 7 times 2 is 14. And I'm going to keep going until I find a number that 4 is also a factor of. 7 times 4 is 28. That number is the common denominator for 4 and 7. So we need to convert each of those original fractions into a fraction with this new denominator of 28. Now, if we make a change in the denominator, we also have to update the numerator. So notice from here to here, we multiplied by 7. We're going to do the same thing to that numerator, and 3 times 7 gives us a new numerator of 21. On the second fraction, we're going to do the same thing. What did we multiply 7 by to get 28? Looks like we multiplied by 4. Do the same thing for the numerator, and we have 8/28. We're going to finish by adding those two numerators together. 21 plus 8 is 29, and we keep the same denominator of 28. That is a reduced fraction. It happens to be improper, but in college algebra, the practice is to leave it improper and to not write it as a mixed fraction. Your calculator will do the same thing. So let's verify this with our calculator. 3 divided by 4 plus 2 divided by 7. Now remember, when we press enter, it gives us the decimal form of the answer, but we can kind of shortcut it here and go ahead and press our math button, choose option number 1, fraction, and press enter, and observe your calculator also leaves it as an improper fraction, 29/28. All right, one more problem for this subsection. We need a common denominator between 6 and 3. Again, you can take the biggest number, 6, list its multiples, and already we have arrived at a number that has both 6 and 3 as one of its factors. So our common denominator is going to be 6. Notice that's not going to require any change for that first numerator. We will have to update the second fraction though. If I multiply 3 by 2, I get 6. So we need to do the same thing to that numerator. So our new numerator here is 4. Now we can subtract our numerators. 1 minus 4 gives me -3, and we have the common denominator of 6. Don't stop there. Make sure that your fraction is reduced. So divide the top by 3. 3 divided by 3 is, or -3 divided by 3 is -1. 6 divided by 3 is 2. So our final result is -1/2. But let's double check on our calculator. 1/6 minus 2/3. Turn that into a fraction, and we end up with -1/2. So in this subsection, we reviewed the 4 basic operations on fractions. Multiplication of fractions. Remember, we just multiply straight across numerators and denominators. No common denominator is necessary. For division, we convert it into a multiplication problem by changing the operation from division to multiplication and inverting that second fraction. Then we multiply straight across numerators and denominators and reduce. For adding and subtracting fractions, an LCD is necessary. Let's make that note. LCD, lowest common denominator, is required. So if we already have a common denominator, We simply translate that denominator over into the answer and apply the operation to the top. And finally, if we have unlike denominators, we want to find a common denominator, update each fraction, and then carry out the answer. Please practice with your calculator so you'll know the correct way to enter those. And in the next video, we'll learn about the order of operations.